Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this debate on whether the US-led Summit for Democracy can have a positive impact on global democracy. My name is Richard Young, so I work at Carnegie Europe, and I will be chairing this debate for the next hour up to 5 p.m. This debate is run by Carnegie Europe, the European Partnership for Democracy, and the Open Governance Partnership. It's the latest in a series of Oxford-style debates we've been running on democracy-related issues since the beginning of 2021. So today we're focusing on the follow-up to the Summit for Democracy that was held in early December last year. I think everyone on the call will know the background, that after the Trump administration was such bad news for democracy, both within the United States and internationally, President Biden made the commitment to holding a summit for democracy during the first year of his administration. This was held in December after a long year of preparation. This engendered quite opposing views when he made the commitment. Critics suggested that perhaps this was not the right time to hold such a summit. It might raise expectations to unrealistic levels. Perhaps internal problems in the United States meant that the US perhaps wasn't the right player to be leading a new initiative on global democracy. Supporters suggested this was a very much overdue initiative. It was the US coming back to show strong commitment to democracy globally, and this summit was exactly what was needed to revive a flagging international agenda for democracy support. So after a year of preparations, we all know the summit was held. It was a success to the extent that over 100 leaders attended. They all made commitments to strengthen democracy within their own countries and internationally. And as everyone knows, we now have a year of action to introduce concrete initiatives leading up to a potential second summit at the end of 2022. So positive in all those senses. Still not clear, however, what the real political impact of this new summit process will be, and how far democracies around the world will actually be willing to coordinate to give new life to international support for democratic norms. So there was a lot of debate around the summit itself. Our focus in this debate is going to be different. We thought it would help move the debate into the next stage to focus on what the longer term impact of this incipient summit process is likely to be. So to look over the next few years, whether this new commitment is likely to lead into something really tangible and of lasting impact to global democracy. To help us debate this very important issue, we have two eminently qualified speakers. We have Tonu Basu, who's Deputy Director at the OGP. She's leading there on thematic policies and partnerships that are very much related to the kinds of initiatives that should be developed now during this year of action. She was involved in the summit and is set to play quite a significant role in the follow-on. So welcome to Tonu. Then we have Oliver Stuenkel, who's a professor at the Getulio Vargas Foundation School of International Relations in Sao Paulo, a long-term collaborator on many Carnegie projects with us over the years, also currently a visiting fellow at Carnegie. We will hear first from Tonu, who will make the case, the positive case, for suggesting that this summit can lead into something of positive, tangible impact. Then we will hear from Oliver, who will put the more skeptical, critical point of view. We'll hear 10 minutes from each of those. While they are speaking, we encourage participants to send in questions via Slido, and then we'll have some open debate around those questions up to 5 p.m. Before I turn the floor to Tonu, we have one additional thing to do before we start the debate, and that is just to conduct a quick Slido poll to get a feel for people's initial views on these questions before we begin the debate. So if my colleagues should be due to put the poll on your screens. So there you have three options. Just take 30 seconds to answer which of those options you think is better. The success or failure depends entirely on the political will to implement the summit's commitments. The second question, no, the summit was not inclusive and operational enough to truly create a new kind of democracy-related partnership. The third option, yes, the summit creates new momentum for international cooperation as well as a process for global action. Just wait 30 seconds for people to decide their answers on that. I think that's sufficient time to see the answers are heavily weighted to the first option. We'll perhaps revisit that if we have time at the end of the debate to see if people have been swayed one way or another by our two speakers. If we then can perhaps stop the poll, and I will hand the floor to Tonu to lead us off, putting the positive case in favor of the Summit for Democracy and the process that is now set to follow in its aftermath. Tonu.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for sharing this, and many thanks to Carnegie, the European Partnership, EPD, also for co-hosting this debate. It is a timely conversation, as you said, as we all emerge from the holidays, having time to look back at the December summit and look ahead as we anticipate the commitments made by the participating countries. And we anticipate that these commitments will be published by the end of the month for the year of action. Now, as you said, I'm arguing that the Summit for Democracy indeed can deliver. And further, there are a few things that need to be lined up in order to get there, drawing on our work at the Open Government Partnership, where we have experience from over a decade of working on democracy and open government issues with our 78 member countries. Now, I'm making an argument about sort of three points, really. First, again, echoing some of what you said, that the Summit for Democracy sent an important signal about the value of democracy in international politics. Second, that we need to now shift focus away from the event itself and really focus on follow-up and accountability for implementation at the country level. And third, that a crucial factor in the success of the Summit for Democracy will be the extent to which the US and other governments can engage and empower a broader ecosystem of independent media, civil society, and business in this year of action. And where this is done well, it will be a contributing factor to delivery. So now first, as a lot of people who've spoken in favor of the summit have indeed said it sent an important signal, there is no denying the fact that there was an urgent need for the renewal of multilateralism, and one that stands for the values of liberal democracy, and one backed by high-level political leadership from a country like the US, both for its important geopolitical standing and as well as recognition that its own democracy is not one to be taken for granted, as the last 4 years showed. Now, at a time when we have seen over 15 consecutive years of democratic backsliding, indicators from the Freedom House, which has been further exacerbated by the pandemic, the international community really needed a moment of collective recognition of the importance of democracy and the issues that drive and protect it. And actually, ahead of the December virtual summit, the fact that China and Russia felt compelled to issue a joint opinion piece about their justification of their own models of democracy goes to show that the summit didn't quite go unnoticed. Now, further, some of the countries that have been slipping on democracy rankings, the participation of their heads of state and government at the summit provided the context for debate on these indices in mainstream news media back home, and provided a boost to local civil society and independent media to question performance in context of the claims made in the summit speeches. The two-day summit was pre-recorded, consisted of pre-recorded remarks from heads of state and government, and it didn't quite have the same impact that an in-person gathering would have had. But now we really need to see what the second Summit for Democracy in sort of coming after the year of action can really do once this has set the agenda and really tone of the kind of commitments we want to see. Now, for those of you who are familiar with what the Summit for Democracy sought to do, it sought to tackle issues under three streams. One was countering authoritarianism, the second was combating corruption, and then the third was defending human rights. And on a few of these, and most notably on anti-corruption, the summit really did get the ball rolling on a few things, and I will come to that later. Now, my second point, and really the most important one in this conversation in my mind, is why we need to shift focus from the two-day event to follow-up and accountability for implementation. And really, that's where we'll write the proof of the pudding. Now, summits on their own really don't translate into reform, but there are steps one can take to use the political momentum effectively. Now, a two-day event is hardly something that gives us information about longer-term impact. And so how can we move away from the summitry of speeches and really think about implementation and accountability at the country level in each of the participating countries? Now, for the S4D1, or the Summit for Democracy 1, to serve as an action-forcing moment, the year of action will provide that implementation and follow-up. I argue that 1 year is a good time to see where things can get started and seed some important projects for sustained follow-up. What this does mean, though, is that there is greater pressure on the US to make adjustments on how they plan Summit for Democracy 2 and what they set up as infrastructure through this year of action. Now, participating governments are supposed to announce new commitments by the end of this month, specifying concrete reforms at home. Some countries like Taiwan published their commitments earlier this week, and some other G7 countries are apparently set to publish by the end of the month. As a first step, the US government must ensure that all commitments made at the summit are indeed published and are made transparent and accessible, including to civil society in those countries. Here, the US also needs to send a clear message on implementation and provide implementation support to countries that need it, including through its vast diplomatic and development network. Additionally, it also needs to lead by example on its own commitments. Where small groups of countries have been leading, the International Summit for Democracy, or a summit like this, can achieve a tipping point. So really have a coalition lead on a few specific issues. And from OGP, we know that coalitions for action, where countries make these voluntary commitments, do work. And they work more than countries implementing their reforms in isolation. Again, this is something the US is well positioned to help enact. Finally, the Biden administration needs to outline how these commitments will be monitored. Summit commitments alone, without being embedded in follow-up structures, are less likely to be implemented in our experience. Now, Transparency International UK had analyzed data from the 2016 UK Anti-Corruption Summit. Some of you may remember that summit, which we at OGP also cross-checked with our own data. And that showed that only when the summit commitments were embedded in concrete implementation plans, such as national development plans, or in many cases, OGP action plans, there was greater likelihood of implementation. And its associated finding was that spaces for multi-stakeholder dialogue are associated with higher levels of implementation of these reforms and help get more domestic buy-in and engagement for implementation, which brings me to my third and final point, that a crucial factor really will be how well independent media and civil society are engaged and empowered. Now, involving these actors are critical to the success of the Summit for Democracy and the values it claims to stand for. A Summit for Democracy cannot be left alone to political declarations, but bringing these actors in the year of action right from the very beginning. And really, this is something that multilateral fora like G7, G20, etc., haven't really been able to do in a sustained manner. The real work in building and rebuilding democracy comes from citizen movements and grassroots participation, much as it does from political leadership. Now, data that we have seen from 10 years of OGP provides an instructive reference here. We analyzed data, including from about 4,000 reforms that have been co-created between government and civil society, and found that involving civil society in co-creating, but also implementing these reforms was a strong predictor of ambitious commitments, rates of implementation, and early results. Now, what the US government needs to do, therefore, is to stress that in this year of action, participating governments need to consult civil society throughout the process, as well as other stakeholders like business and media, and make it an inclusive process. This also means that the US government needs to do this domestically. I know a lot of US civil society actors have been asking for this. and including by hosting regular interagency meetings and check-ins. Now, I understand some of this movement has been happening on anti-corruption measures, for instance, and that is a good start. US government also needs to resource and empower civil society abroad in conjunction with their support for other development projects, given what their diplomatic and development networks already do across issues of democracy, corruption, and human rights programming. Now, we've seen a few countries hold consultations with civil society in the run-up to Summit for Democracy 1, but really hope we can see a lot more, and then the US can really facilitate a lot more in the year of action. Further, as the pandemic continues to persist, unfortunately, and governments use this as a pretext to control democratic freedoms through unregulated emergency powers, the US also needs to ensure that some of these issues, as brought up in Summit for Democracy 1, find a place in the diplomatic dialogue and follow through that they help set in motion. Now, to close, the Summit for Democracy in December was an important signal to send. We all welcome it. And it really was the right signal sent. But the year of action with civil society and with concrete follow-up at the country level is where the magic will happen. Thanks, Richard, and back to you.
Thank you, Tonu. The positive case very, very eloquently put. Lots of potential for widening the coalitions of democratic action and evidence from other organizations that such alliances can work and have a real tangible impact on the line. Tonu, just before I give the floor to Oliver, I suppose one very obvious question and the most frequently made criticism over recent months has been that American democracy is in such a fragile condition that this perhaps isn't the most opportune moment for the US itself to be leading such a process, and other countries are always going to, at the moment, going to come back and question whether the US actually has the legitimacy to be pursuing such an assertive agenda on democracy at the moment. You're convinced that that problem can be dealt with, are you? Or do you think certain things would still need to be done in order to be dealt with? Because it strikes me that is an issue, whether fairly or unfairly, it is an issue that's going to keep cropping up in this year of action.
I think that's a fair criticism, and I understand where people making that are coming from. I think there are a couple of things that I think the US has started doing and could do a lot more of. I think one is just, I think in some of the speeches made at the Summit for Democracy, both by President Biden, but other officials, show very much a willingness for the US to say that, look, we have a long way to travel. I mean, last January, we saw events in the US that were not promising for any democracy, let alone the US. And the fact that in December, we have a head of state saying that, look, we have some ways we need to go is an important signal. But also the fact that while, in the wake of the summit, the US did launch some pretty important policy initiatives, including the first ever sort of comprehensive anti-corruption strategy that was not just looking at anti-corruption abroad, but very much also on the kinds of gaps that they need to fill at home. And I think that's the right signal to send.
Thank you, Tonu. We'll hand the floor to Oliver. Oliver has been writing on these issues for many, many years and reflecting on them from a slightly more critical point of view. Oliver will hear your opposing argument.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event. I first of all like to say that I'm very much supportive of democracy, and I also think that there have been numerous positive initiatives of democracy promotion over the past years. So I'm not opposed in principle to these things, but I do think that the way the summit was done is unlikely to have a tangible impact, or I'm profoundly skeptical. And I do hope I'm wrong about these things, but I do think for three reasons that we will most likely be disappointed. And the first, and I'm saying this very much from a non-US perspective, from perhaps a Latin American perspective, looking at these events. And the first is that despite the summit's visibility, I think there continues to be a profound mix-up between democracy promotion and US geopolitical interests. And I think that, of course, fuels and makes it easy for critics across the world to question the motives behind the summit, the impact of the summit. And I think that's not even true only in policymaking circles. Francis Fukuyama wrote a piece in the New York Times the other day, and he said the global rollback of democracy has been led by two rising authoritarian countries, Russia and China. So this narrative, this divisive democracies versus autocracies rhetoric is seen with a lot of caution by countries around the world, because, and I actually believe that Russia and China aren't the main reasons for the fact that democracy is in crisis. There's many other reasons. Most of them are local, most of them are domestic. So focusing on Moscow and Beijing makes other countries question whether the entire edifice of US democracy promotion isn't actually about great power competition. And we're, of course, back in great power competition. So it's a legitimate question to ask. But I think in the context of the summit, there's been too many comments or arguments being made by the US government that this is really a battle between two worlds. And that in the past has led to a lot of skepticism. Some of you will remember that U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright promoted the creation of the Community of Democracies in 2000. At the time, Brazil's President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who is very much a Democrat, declined to take a leading role in it because it could have created difficulties with other Latin American countries that would have been excluded from this community of democracies, but also because many countries in the world, the majority in fact, is increasingly economically dependent on China, and is unwilling to embark on that with us or against us narrative. And I think that that has been exacerbated by the fact that some democracies, such as Bolivia, were excluded from the summit. And of course, the sense was that was because those are countries with a difficult relationship with the United States, and some others, some authoritarian countries actually participated. I also would like to question the decision to invite people like Jair Bolsonaro, who evidently has an interest in actively eroding democracy. And I think having him there, in a sense, makes it more difficult to say that this summit is really a serious idea that the United States would like to pursue. Now, just coming to the case of Brazil again, I think from the Brazilian government's perspective, it's not entirely clear that the United States would actively, punish Brazil in any way if, for example, the government decided to embark on something like January 6th in the United States. Perhaps the president will not recognize or will not accept defeat. And it is not entirely clear how the United States would react to that. Seems like the US communication towards Brazil is a bit like, well, what's also important is that you collaborate with us on climate change, on the whole 5G issue and containing China. So I do realize that there are many issues involved, many different US interests, but the perception is a bit that that the issue of democracy was not beyond, among the top two interests as the United States is engaging Brazil. And I think many other countries have that perception as well. The second issue, and Richard has mentioned this, I think that the democracy in the United States is clearly in crisis. And I think that particularly now, this year of action, we may see the Republican Party gaining control of Congress and the Senate. And I think the global perception a year after January 6th is that the perpetrators and the people behind this assault on democracy have not only not been punished sufficiently, they're on the rise again. There is some likelihood of US democracy breaking down. Is actually used in debates across the world as a case that's profoundly worrisome. So I think that perhaps the second summit could take place somewhere else, could have a country like Uruguay New Zealand or Botswana in the lead, or at least co-host the event, to show that, you know, there are other great examples, and because I think the US legitimacy at this stage, due to its domestic political crisis, is of course compromised. And the third issue, and here I fully agree with Tonu, I think it's important to follow up specifically what the monitoring mechanisms are. Ideally, these should be permanent. It's not only about, you know, doing this for a year, but it's something that should be integrated into a country's policymaking process. And my sense is that, and again, that's the sense I'm having when speaking to members of the Brazilian government, that the promises you know, they will make will not be very serious, and they will obviously they will either be so vague that, you know, nobody can actually assess them adequately, or they will just not honor them fully, and do not expect a pushback based after you know, assessing that Brazil has actually failed to live up to its promises. So I think, and again, I hope to be surprised, but my sense is that there's no clarity of how countries that will flout the promises they've made for themselves will actually be punished by either the United States or the community of democracies around the world. So that's the third, and I'll give the word back to Richard. Thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. Before we turn to the questions coming in from participants, I guess the most obvious pushback against your skeptical argument would be that if the US doesn't lead this kind of process, then who does? I think your initial point that is well taken and was borne out by research actually we did in Carnegie interviewing diplomats in other democracies around the world, particularly Asian democracies, that the main concern was with the US conflating democracy support with its own geopolitical positioning. But if so many democracies around the world dislike that and are concerned about that, then doesn't that beg the question of why other democracies didn't step forward themselves to try and create this kind of momentum, and perhaps why they waited so long for the US to take up the baton again? Is it, in your view, is it, you say you don't oppose democracy support in principle, but is it so ridiculous to suggest that another coalition of democracies could play more of a leading role, or does it ultimately come down to the US, even if other democracies like Brazil and other powers are suspicious of this geopoliticization of the democracy agenda?
Yeah, well, I think that of course it's better the US. I mean, I still believe, and others have said it would be better not to have the summit at all. Steve Walt has actually made this point. He said, you know, thank God it was online, so it didn't actually use up that much bandwidth. I actually disagree with that. I think it's important to focus on that. I do think that perhaps you know, the United States and a few other countries could have had somewhat more legitimacy. But I do agree that there's no other obvious candidate to lead that global effort. But I think that making this, you know, as I said, perhaps the second meeting somewhere else, shining light on other successful democracies, I think would underline the fact that this is not about the United States sort of projecting some kind of model, but this is about a joint, inclusive conversation about how to address challenges that, you know, democracies virtually everywhere are facing, but the United States in particular is right now not in an example to follow, but perhaps a case that allows other countries to take preventive steps to avoid what has happened in the United States.
Before I turn to the questions, Tonu, do you want to come back at anything Oliver has said?
Yes, and especially the last point. I think I do. I mean, as I said earlier, Richard, I see where the skeptics are coming from, that the US is not sort of, you know, bastion of democracy right now, and so how can that be mitigated, or how can it make more inclusive, this Summit for Democracy? Now, I think I would argue that democracy is not a one-issue agenda, right? And the Summit for Democracy itself and the various issues it had in there was at least a start of that conversation. And I think one way that momentum could be sustained in the year of action and beyond is really get those coalitions across, not just even just for the whole summit, but in the issues issues that each of these countries lead on. I mean, in OGP, we see countries making commitments on various issues. I can't point to a single country and say, well, they are a star, right? But I can point out countries that say, look, on tackling anonymous companies, this country is doing well. On preserving freedom of expression, this country is doing well. And I think there are organizations that have said that and suggested that to the US in saying, look, can there be coalitions that can come out of this? And then can they be spun off as sort of coalitions of the willing around these issues? And I really think that's the way forward. And in a way, what Oliver is saying.
So actually building on that, Tonu, Thomas Carruthers, who's Vice President at Carnegie and Director of all our democracy work, has a question specifically about the summit next year. He asks, what in very operational terms can the US do to make the summit more concrete, more inclusive, to address some of the criticisms that have been addressed against the way it was organized in December? Do you both think there are concrete things that could be done to address some of these concerns and make the event, if it does take place at the end of this year, more successful and more legitimate amongst a wider range of democratic states?
Yes, I absolutely think so. And that's a great question as we think about it. And we do have a whole year, the Biden administration has a whole year to think about it as well. I think there are a couple of very concrete things, and I'll touch on a couple of things I mentioned already. One is that I think the involvement of civil society is key. Of course, it was an important signal that civil society was on several of the panels in the December event. And, the panels weren't just heads of state speeches alone, they were multi-stakeholder. But I think there are more things that the US could do to ensure that civil society is involved in the planning of the Summit for Democracy too, based on the kinds of issues and traction that we are seeing over the year of action. That's one. The second is, I think the US could send a strong signal. It has already been making some of the right noises, but it could certainly send a stronger signal that for any country coming to Summit for Democracy too, there should be conversations that they already have with civil society at home, so that this issue is very much about domestic accountability and not just international posturing. And I think, when countries come into the next summit saying that, look, we consulted with media, civil society, business, academia, others at home, and these are some of the issues, and this is the way we're following up, I think that would be an important thing to make sure that the summit really has some teeth and that it is more concrete and inclusive.
Oliver, I guess you've already made the fairly far-reaching suggestion. I think actually it's an interesting one that maybe other countries could be invited to co-host or something along those lines, about additional things that could address some of the quite strong criticisms you've expressed.
Well, I think that leaders like Bolsonaro should not allow to show up again and basically tick the box and then disengage. I think that needs to be. It's a difficult summit to have because it may involve criticizing participants, participating governments, participating heads of state. Pressure needs to be built up, and I think it's necessary to signal to participating governments that if they are to be there, then they're liable to criticism for not having implemented or not having followed up on their promises made a year earlier. And if that doesn't suit them, then they won't show up. And I think that in itself is an important mechanism. So I think if everybody who has been there, the model students and those who just forgot about what they promised, they all show up, they can do their pre-recorded speech and then move on. I think it does create the perception that this is just a talking shop. But so it's important to have teeth and to actually signal and make clear that which countries or which governments have done a good job and which ones haven't.
If that happens, that strikes me as a key question. Who decides if certain leaders are to be excluded next year who did attend the summit last December? Who decides that? Is it to be the US unilaterally? Can we put together a more inclusive process? Perhaps, Tonu, using your suggestion about greater civil society involvement over the next year to make those decisions. Who makes that call? That's going to be very, very sensitive. Is there a way of deciding that? I can't see is the US really unilaterally going to take such difficult decisions to exclude leaders who were included only a month ago?
Tony, do you want to go ahead, Tonu? Because I don't want to put you on the spot for a suggestion I made. So
I do want to respond to this, but I will go after you.
No, I'm just saying, I think perhaps rather than excluding the leaders or the governments who are showing up and who, there must be some kind of process that it's clear that they may be subject to explicit criticism, and some may end up pulling out because they don't want to have that experience. But I think that's necessary for it not to be just some kind of some kind of ritual, some symbolic activity. Again, there's several countries that did, several leaders who spoke at the summit who are, I think, convinced autocrats or perhaps want to be autocrats, and I think they need to be put on the spot once that meeting takes place, hopefully in person.
If I may come in. Yeah. So I mean, similar to I am in agreement with Oliver on this point. I think I don't think inviting or disinviting, I think that's not a productive argument to have at this stage. I do think the better conversation is, well, once a country has committed to come, how do we raise the bar for their participation, and what are the things that they need to do along with, and it's not just, like I said, international posturing, but on specific issues that the summit has lined up. How is it following up? How is it working with civil society? And what does it have to then show independently for those commitments made? I think that would be a better conversation to have.
Okay, just following that train of thought there, I'm just trying to juggle all the questions coming in here, but perhaps we've been focusing on the negative cases where the problems are, but we have one interesting question. This is actually from Ken Gottfried at EPD. What about the other side of the coin? Were there any countries who impressed you with the positive strength of their commitments and engagement with the summit that could actually provide a counterpoint to all the negative worries and trends, and serve as beacons for the way in which countries can use the summit process genuinely to deepen the quality of their democracy? Who are the positive stars for you in the summit, and what might follow in its aftermath? Tony, perhaps do you want to have a go at that one first?
Sure. I mean, I've yet to see the commitments in writing, Richard. So I followed the conversations and I heard the speeches, but I think the commitments that will be published later in January will really be where we'll see some of the granularity and some of the specificity we want to see. That said, I will say there were countries that, for instance, very clearly mentioned follow-up, that, we will be doing this through our, UNCAC or UN Anti-Corruption Convention followed through, or we will be doing this through legislation this year, or, for instance, we'll be working with civil society and putting this in our OGP action plan. So I think when we look at the commitments coming out in January, looking at that kind of specificity and granularity is, I think, what I will be looking for, and I hope we all will be looking out for. So I think a little too early to tell before we see actually what's in writing.
Oliver, in Latin America, Chile and Colombia are often mentioned now as positive reference points that could really play more of a proactive and prominent role in international democracy support and serving as models for countries that have turned things around and executed quite inclusive reform processes. Would you agree that there are positive cases as well that can be harnessed?
Absolutely. And I would think that it is important to really publicize the promises made by summit participants as much as possible. It's always, you have a lot of people talking about these summits. It really will take some work to get the word out of what governments have said, and some will be vague, and there should be criticism if they're too vague, because whatever governments say, it's really important to push them also to make this as measurable as possible. And I think that that will be also, to some extent, the responsibility of civil society, people working on these issues, to make that as visible as possible. Now, I absolutely think that there are positive examples. Colombia actually is a bit of a difficult issue right now, because it will have an election during this year of action, so it's really uncertain. of what will happen. I think it's certainly easier for countries that do not have a power transition over the next 12 months. In Chile, certainly, I think a country that is making an earnest effort to address the shortcomings of its political economic system in a very cohesive, very inclusive way. So I absolutely think that Chile could be a country for others to look towards and try to extract sort of the lessons learned to apply at home.
I guess as we've got you here, Oliver, we should ask you what's likely to happen in Brazil this year and how that will perhaps pivotally change Brazil's engagement in this process. Presumably, if Bolsonaro prevails, Brazil's status as a positive democratic template is completely off the agenda. But is there any prospect that Brazil could take a more democratic action and then perhaps emerge as a more significant player in the summit process?
Well, that of course all depends on what will happen in October. I think there's a lot of fear that the trend of Bolsonaro copying or utilizing some of the strategies that the Trump administration has used will continue. So a lot of concern about political violence, about the president not, if he loses, and lots of polls suggest he will lose, whether he will accept the result, as happened in Chile, which I think was a fantastic example of the power of institutions, because there was somebody who mirrored himself entirely in Bolsonaro or in Pinochet or Trump and lost, and then immediately after the election congratulated the winner. And that wasn't necessarily because of his convictions, but because Chile's political traditions and institutions are tremendously stable. So I think that was a great example. In Brazil, I think also lots of questions about the role of the armed forces, but certainly the possibility also of becoming an example of how to overcome these very difficult moments, because I think we still don't have enough examples out there of countries that go through this profound polarization, destructive and paralyzing polarization, and then emerge and are able to reinitiate a constructive a public discussion. So I think there is certainly a chance that Brazil, after October, may then get back together, but I think it's a long process.
Perhaps a country like Korea, we do have several questions actually about the potential that there might be or might not be for Asian democracies in particular stepping up and playing a more significant role that you both might want to come back on. But just wanted to say that we're entering more or less the kind of last lap of our conversation. We've talked a lot about the overarching geopolitics and political considerations. Just before we finish, I did want to touch on this theme of what kind of issues might be most important and most valuable to address during this year of action. I think this relates back to your point about these alliances of collective action, Tonu, that you stressed in your opening remarks. We have several questions around this theme. Carl Dolan at OSEPI, the Open Society European Policy Institute, asks you both what themes, what policy issues specifically you think should be stressed, given priority during the year of action. And we have several, for example, from Alexander Gemescu on the issue of technology that was stressed at the summit, but still not clear exactly what the summit process can add in tangible terms to a lot of other international initiatives that already exist on digital democracy and digital technology. So perhaps, Tony, you wanted to address this one first. So on specific themes now that we should prioritize during the next year.
Yeah, so I think, Richard, the summit did it was a good start on the kind of themes of the overall sort of bouquet of issues that were laid out. A lot of these I didn't quite hear them mentioned in speeches, but I would like to see those and whether to see those details and commitments. So starting on I think the last point on the technology side, I think there's a lot there that needs to be done on sort of technology and democracy, whether it is sort of transparency around algorithms, political advertising, platform accountability, and because all of these are very much have a huge influence on democratic integrity, on electoral integrity. So I think there's a lot there. I don't think the answer is necessarily coming up with new initiatives. I recognize, and having worked with several governments now, I recognize it is very tempting just to go sort of add a new initiative. I think the focus needs to be to work with existing partners, see what energy is out there, and then, like I said, find those bright spots and empower them and really help forge those coalitions. So that's on technology. I think on corruption, as I said several times, there was some really good, there was a good start that was made on several issues. So beneficial ownership transparency, something that, again, came up in the US last year. The US really was lagging behind on tackling anonymous companies and corporate transparency. And now there is, once Congress passed the relevant legislation, now we have Treasury and Commerce and others working on this with the White House, and I think that's a positive signal. There's a huge momentum. In open government partnership, there are about 30 countries that are implementing reform on this that really has a huge impact on illicit financial flows and transnational corruption. Foreign bribery is another one that really started off a little bit at the summit, but I think there is a lot more that could be done. So that's around corruption. And there's a whole host of issues there around contracting, especially given, the pandemic and the kind of corruption we've seen there, and several other things. Then another bucket, and a really, really important one, is around civic rights, civic space, and curtailing emergency powers. I mean, we've talked about the role that independent media and civil society need to play at the summit, but in a lot of these countries, they don't have access to funding. Their funding is constrained. Their functioning is constrained by these governments, and often at the pretext of COVID and COVID-related measures. And I think this is indeed something that this summit needs to sort of really, and the Year of Action needs to address with great urgency. So there are just sort of 2 or 3 sets of issues.
For what it's worth, Tonu, I can see that becoming a very, very important issue during the course of the next year, but also one politically very, very difficult to handle for the next summit. Our colleagues in Civicus have just put out their annual report that makes for very sobering reading, that governments continue to narrow civic space. We all know this is a problem that's been around for over a decade now, and that even now, 2 years on from the initial emergency measures that were introduced to try and mitigate COVID, governments are still narrowing and clamping down on civic rights. And significantly, this is happening even in democratic countries. Even democratic, supposedly liberal, progressive governments are doing this. It's not just the normal culprits that are singled out as being part of the authoritarian surge. And if there are so many governments still engaged in this, often quite clever, subtle ways of narrowing the political space available for civil society, how willing are they going to be to actually bring this into the summit process next year? But then if they don't, it seems to me that once again, the next summit will also be criticized for being fairly cosmetic and not really to getting to grips with the kind of power imbalances that are really eviscerating democratic quality, including in the supposedly advanced consolidated democracies. Oliver, did you have anything to say on the particular themes that you think could most usefully be emphasized this year?
Yeah, so I think that I think corruption is a key issue. I think things that technical, that are sort of less easily geopoliticized are better. I know I keep talking about this, but whenever I speak about democracy promotion to colleagues across Latin America, you immediately get this, this issue about U.S. political interests, and I think that that it's more difficult to do that when you talk about more technical cooperation, when, for example, combating money laundering, corruption, bribery, etc. These are really important issues. And that leads me to a second point. And I must say, as a caveat, I get bogged down in these discussions so often where people say, well, does democracy deliver more than autocracy? And I think that's a bit dangerous, because there is an inherent value to democracy, which it doesn't necessarily need to deliver more tangibly to people in terms of GDP per capita or public services than an autocracy, because it does provide individual freedoms per se that non-democratic regimes do not provide. At the same time, it is obviously crucial for the resilience of democratic regimes around the world that governments can manage to provide public services, can combat inequality. In addition to what Tonu has said about, civic space, which are all really important. But I think a conversation must be had also of how governments address the tremendous difficulties, the economic difficulties that have emerged in the context of the pandemic, provide better public services in the area of education and health. I know these are very, very big issues, but I think that continues to be a big challenge. And then finally, one issue that hasn't come up that much during the Summit of the Democracies, but which is a huge challenge, at least in Latin America, is we need to get the military out of politics again and out of public services again, because they have grown tremendously throughout the pandemic. I think that was positive in some cases, delivering vaccines. Sometimes the best institution which can do that is the military, but we've seen some signals that it's not that easy to get them out again now that we're sort of trying to get back to normal. And it must be said that in many countries, including Brazil, the armed forces are the major threat to democratic rule. And I think we need to talk more about ways to instill a democratic commitment within the armed forces, and also a sense that their role is not in politics. They can specifically provide some public services. And that's, I think, an issue where the United States has a lot to teach, because there are clearly what we've seen over the past years. There was never any doubt about how the US armed forces would react to authoritarian instincts by President Trump.
Excellent point. That would take the summit process into the most sensitive territory imaginable. So, okay, we've run through some of the thematic priorities. Final question before we wrap up on different geographical priorities. We've got several questions, including one from Mohamed Nasir on which region should be the priority over the year of action and at the next summit. The Middle East was conspicuously absent from the first summit. One wonders if there should be an effort to try and include more Middle Eastern states. Africa had the largest number of participants. Maybe, Tony, you think that would be the area to prioritize in terms of building these collective action coalitions, or perhaps Latin America, Oliver, you think should be the region that would be given more prominence. So just a quick word on geographical priorities you would like to see stressed in the next year. Why didn't you have a first crack at that, Oliver?
I'll be very brief to make sure that Tonu has enough time. I just think that it's really important to focus on countries where democracy is at an imminent risk right now, be it through in a situation where the president may not accept the outcome of an election, where things are really quite urgent. I think these must be there must be a clear focus, because unless the United States makes very, very clear that there are concrete consequences, be it unilateral, be it multilateral, to presidents, for example, not accepting the result of the election, whatever happens beyond that will not be taken very seriously, because everybody will say, well, you didn't seem to really react very quickly or in a coherent fashion when democracy went over the cliff in a country like Brazil, for example. So I wouldn't say there should be any specific geographical focus, but I think we need to focus on countries where democracy is at most imminent risk.
Okay, good point. For what it's worth, it seems to me that would be an important contribution that a wider alliance could make, but presumably that would need the alliances there would need to be fairly flexible and fast moving, not too heavy in institutional terms. So I think in most countries you wouldn't get a whole global coalition of democratic states operating, but perhaps a more flexible select group of democracies. So I think that perhaps points to the risk of over-institutionalizing any initiatives in this way. Tonu, on the geographical priorities?
I do agree with Oliver that I don't think the geographical lens is the right one to use, but where I depart from what Oliver said is I was going to come at it from the other side, and I said I think that countries that are in transition, that are making positive steps towards democracy, but really need that extra push and that encouragement should be prioritized. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, when Armenia, right after the revolution, there was a fantastic new government in place. Civil society from the outside was in government, and it was, a government that was very sort of committed to a reform agenda. And in OGP, we began, and then a lot of other partners began working with government, civil society there, and have seen a lot of sort of, in the early years, saw a very, very promising number of anti-corruption and other initiatives, really strengthening the role of civil society and other independent actors. And I do think that's one really important role that this summit can play. And there are a lot of sort of, those kind of democracies in transition that kind of need that support. So that's one. And then the second is, I think there are countries that are sort of bright spots. So you mentioned Korea. South Korea was our co-chair, Open Government Partnership co-chair just last year. And I do think they're sort of, one of the countries that are unique in the way that they really opened up space for civil society, really stand up for civic space, and are making an important contribution to the agenda for democracy. And there are several others like that. And I think it is also important to have those bright spots there, because at the end of the day, we really need that kind of broader coalition to stand for democracy and a lot of the issues that we're talking about.
Which perhaps leads me to a very final question, because we are almost out of time. A final question that perhaps puts you both rather unfairly on the spot, but it has to do with, Tony, your point about the form of coalitions. If you were to both imagine us 5 years in the future and imagine that this summit process had gained some kind of long-term momentum, what would be your kind of ideal form of initiative that was still in place in 5 years? What exact form would you like some kind of international democracy initiative to take? Who would be leading it? What kind of states would be involved? Would it be a standalone initiative? Should it be folded into the United Nations or the already existing community of democracies? Would it be one that equally balanced states and civil society? So you were perhaps suggesting, Tonu, with international organizations involved as well. So if you could kind of write the ideal recipe in a way for international democratic coordination and imagine implementing this in 5 years, what would be your ideal template, as it were?
It's such an easy one. I'll let Tonu go first.
Actually, that's not so bad. So I think, it's a two-part answer, Richard. One is, I don't think it needs a new initiative. As I said, I don't think democracy is a single issue sort of agenda. I don't think there should be one initiative that's sort of the protector of democracies everywhere. We have several. We have the Open Government Partnership, sort of, multi-stakeholder partnership that was initiated by eight member states and 9 civil society. Now we've grown to a partnership of 78. There are several others in other spaces and fields. You mentioned the Community of Democracy. There's the Freedom Online Coalition and the digital space. So I think there are initiatives out there. So I don't think there needs to be one, which brings me to my second part. I think what I would love to see is coalitions, self-driving, multi-stakeholder coalitions around specific issues, especially that's driven by countries that are implementing them. So, in OJP, we've seen one just grow out on beneficial ownership, so tackling anonymous companies. And there is a group of 5, 6 countries that have said, well, we are moving forward on publishing registers of beneficial ownership, making them public. And we want to drive forward an agenda that really is inclusive of others. I would love to see another one on Civic Space. We've just launched a network on Civic Space, learning network, peer learning network, but we really like to see governments on that agenda. Similarly, I think on sort of digital, a lot of these issues that I talked about, like tackling surveillance, like tackling platform accountability, I think seeing self-driving coalitions of countries do that and really show those results in 5 years would be what I'd love to see.
Oliver?
Just I'll add in 30 seconds. I think that from a geographic perspective, I'd like this to be as broadly spread out with governments, civil society organizations from really across the world taking a more active role. The EU, I think, in 5 years should perhaps play a very, very visible role on that, but also a number of stable democracies in Africa, Latin America, which not only support these initiatives but actually host and lead them. I think it's important, it makes them more legitimate. and more relatable to countries that struggle to consolidate their democracies around the world.
Great. We are pretty much out of time. I didn't want to finish the debate, however, without giving our participants the chance to come back at the poll and see if people's views have changed at all on the 3 questions that we asked at the beginning of the debate. So if my colleagues can perhaps share the Slido poll again, just for 30 seconds, very, very quickly. We'll ask people to answer the same questions again and see if the debate has changed people's minds. While those answers are coming through, I will just conclude the debate by thanking both Tonu and Oliver. Excellent contributions, and hopefully this debate, there'll be many, many debates, I'm sure, during this year of action in the lead up to the second summit, but hopefully at least we played a modest role here in nudging forward the debate from the focus on the summit itself into these very important thematic and geographical questions that will now predominate as hopefully governments begin to put some real substance and content into the commitments made at the summit. I'm sure the debates will continue over whether this is a good idea or not, but as it seems to me, as the initiative is now fairly well established, the important thing is to make sure that it does move in a positive direction and does make some tangible impact. The poll has disappeared without my giving a kind of conclusion of it, but it looked to me as if people's views were relatively similar at the end of the debate. So thanks to Tonu and Oliver. Thanks to everyone for joining us in this debate. We look forward to debating in the next in this series very shortly. Thank you very much.
Thanks.